Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Paqui Paredes, and I'm the Dean of the College of Humanities and Social Sciences at Western Washington University. I want to welcome you all to our second Western Horizons, a public webinar series that features faculty and alumni of the college, and that it's organized in collaboration with the Alumni Office. The title of our webinar today is Pandemic Election, Fraud, Voter Suppression, Media, and the 2020 Presidential Contest. Although we're meeting virtually today due to the COVID-19 pandemic, many of you and all of us whom you will be seeing on your screen are located in Bellingham and in tribal lands. So I will start this event with a land acknowledgement. I would like to begin by acknowledging that we gather today on the ancestral homelands of the Coast Salish peoples who have lived in the Salish Sea Basin throughout the San Juan Islands and the North Cascades watershed from time immemorial. Please join me in expressing our deepest respect and gratitude for our Indigenous neighbors, which in Bellingham are the Lummi Nation and the Nooksack tribe, for their enduring care and protection of our shared lands and waterways. Thank you for joining me in this moment of gratitude. And I will now pass the baton to Dr. Marc Geisler, Associate Dean of the College, who will introduce our speakers today and will moderate the panel. Again, thank you so much for joining us, and please enjoy the webinar.
Welcome to this webinar. We're going to start with a 5-minute commentary on the topic from each of our distinguished panelists. I'll introduce each with an abbreviated bio from the webinar announcement. You can go there for more details. After their comments, we'll start with audience questions received in the last week, and we'll proceed by blending in live questions as well. Dr. Rudy Alamillo joined the Department of Political Science at WWU as an assistant professor in 2019. His research examines cross-racial campaign appeals in the United States with a focus on white candidate appeals to minority voters. Dr. Todd Donovan is a professor in the political science department with visiting appointments and fellowships in Australia and New Zealand. His research examines the intersection of political behavior, representation, and electoral institutions, as well as public opinion and direct democracy. And Dr. Carolyn Nielsen is a professor in the WWU Department of Journalism and worked as a newspaper reporter and editor for a decade before becoming a journalism professor. She has extensive experience covering local, state, and national elections and politics, including a brief stint reporting on the Clinton White House. Go ahead and lead us off, Rudy.
Thank you, Mark. I'm grateful for this opportunity to engage Western as well as the broader community around the university. When we decided on the topic for this discussion, I knew I wanted to take some time to talk about voter turnout, since issues like fraud, voter suppression, other things that we'll be talking about today are strongly tied to concerns about who gets to vote. In my classes, I like to tell my students that elections are about turnout. That's why when students were recently asking me about who won the vice presidential debate, who won the presidential debate, I told them that debates aren't really about winning over voters. They're more about energizing your own voters and actually getting them out to head out to the polls and vote. While voter turnout here in the United States has never been particularly stellar, especially compared to other developed democracies, the added wrinkle of COVID-19 presents some problems for voter turnout, especially among communities of color that are being disproportionately impacted by the pandemic, as well as the efforts of some states and the federal government to prevent easier access to voting. I want to step back a bit and talk about the debates just one more time. When you saw Senator Harris and former Vice President Biden during the debates, we saw them make these impassioned pleas to the American public to go out and vote. And I think that this message was especially aimed at voters within that Democratic coalition, young voters, voters of color, and the poor, who often vote at lower turnout rates. Various studies suggest that if African American voter turnout, which declined from 2012 to 2016, if it had just stayed the same, Hillary Clinton would have won Michigan, Wisconsin, and enough other states to actually win the election. Democrats are well aware of this, and that's why so much of their messaging is focused on getting these low propensity voters to actually head out and vote. I'm sure Republicans are also well aware of this, which is why we see so much hesitation from the president and other public officials in states like Texas and Louisiana to make it harder to vote by mail or to just make it harder to vote at all. I think we're a bit spoiled here in Washington because we have a statewide system of mail-in voting that works pretty well. It makes it easy for everyone to cast their ballots. And to be fair, I haven't been in Washington very long. This is my first presidential election here. But from what I can tell and from what the research says, mail-in voting works. And that's why it's disheartening to see politicians take a stand against mail-in voting, especially in the midst of what is hopefully a once-in-a-century pandemic. We've seen the president say that he's against mail-in voting because if you were to make it easier to vote, and this is a direct quote from the president, you'd never have a Republican elected in this country again. The research has actually looked into this very topic and has found no support for this. Research from scholars like Daniel Thompson and Priscilla Southwell that use actual election results from Oregon and our very own state of Washington didn't find that a switch to mail-in voting doomed the Republican Party in this state. They didn't find any significant changes in elections from the lowest level of government to the highest. They did, however, find that switching to mail-in voting increased turnout by an overall margin of 3%, which is not huge, but I don't think anyone would argue that that's a bad thing. Mail-in voting benefits everyone, which is why we've even seen Republican states, such as South Carolina, expand access to voting and actually allow folks to apply for mail-in ballots without having to provide excuses. At the same time, we've actually seen states like Texas, which have gone out of their way to make it harder for folks to vote. We just had the governor in Texas order the counties in that state to close every ballot drop box within those counties except for one. To put into perspective what that means is that here in Washington and in Whatcom, we have one drop box for about every 10,000 voters. And in Harris County, they now have one drop box for about 4.7 million people. And when we look at that, some would call that voter suppression, and I would agree. But the problem is that the charge of voter suppression, as we'll likely talk about a little bit later, that charge of voter suppression is very difficult to prove in the courts, and then that's what it really comes down to. We've also seen an expansion in voter ID laws recently, which folks have also called voter suppression. But again, unless you can prove it in the courts where it really matters, it's kind of difficult to get rid of these things. I'm not in favor of creating barriers to voting. I think that we should protect the right to the vote and expand it as much as possible. But at the same time, if we look at this COVID pandemic and we try to see a bright spot in it, I think that a bright spot of the COVID-19 pandemic is that we've seen both Democratic and Republican states shift towards moving towards mail-in voting. And I think that overall that movement is positive. With that said, I look forward to a great conversation with you, Mark, as well as with Carolyn and Todd.
Thank you, Rudy. Todd.
Thanks, Mark, and thanks for putting on this this webinar. Yeah, I'll follow on from some of the ideas Rudy had here, and I really want to kind of stress the partisan divisions. You know, Rudy said if there's a bright spot, it's that more folks are getting able to vote by mail. Maybe this is a dark spot, as this COVID pandemic also really dramatically illustrates the differences between the parties in terms of how they view voter fraud, how they use perceptions of voter fraud to affect legislation to make it more difficult to vote, and how they affect, sorry, make a note of the time, Professor, how that affects how courts are going to be dealing with this stuff. So to start, you know, we've heard since Trump was running in 2016 that the election is rigged when he didn't think he was going to win, and that there was 3 million fraudulent votes that were potentially going to cost him the popular vote. He didn't just pull this out of thin air. That, you know, we have public opinion going back decades that show Republicans, even before Trump, making up false allegations about fraud. They're far more likely than Democrats to believe that there's voter impersonation. And, you know, this goes back to the incredible divisions between Democratic and Republican legislators and Democratic and Republican voters in terms of support for voter ID law. It's just based on these completely different worldviews about what kind of fraud is out there. And Democrats have their kind of misperceptions about fraud as well, but not in terms of people who are ineligible to vote actually voting. So this stuff predates Trump. And we've had for years this, you know, kind of partisan battle, but now with the attempt to shift to vote by mail in response to the pandemic, we've kind of got this intersection between those voters' attitudes state legislators and the courts and President Trump highlighting the Republicans' attempts to make it more difficult to vote, or you could say highlighting their supposed concerns about perceptions of fraud. And I've been involved in litigation this year in Iowa and Florida and Ohio about even the most microscopic details about election administration. I'll give you one example from Iowa that if you control the state legislature can pass, the Republicans do, they can pass a law that says local election officials can't use the statewide database to tell voters what their voter identification number is. It's like, that sounds innocuous. Then they also say, and when you send out absentee ballot requests, you cannot pre-fill any information for voters. So some county auditors were doing that because they know nobody knows their voter identification number. That goes to the courts. The Republicans win in a sense because they made this crazy law that made it impossible for people to register to vote. And Rudy mentioned the drop boxes. There's the Pennsylvania rulings about whether their secrecy envelopes have to be there for votes to be counted. And it's frustrating. Or in Florida, the rolling back the Citizens Initiative to allow more felons to vote because the Republicans control the state legislature. That goes to federal courts. You went in a trial court to get voting rights expand. And one of the dramatic things we're seeing playing out this year is once those things get to the appellate courts, those appellate courts have changed even since the beginning of some of these trials. They're lengthy trials and they have Trump appointees, and the ruling goes against the voters essentially. So I'll say one more thing. So this is really, this is gonna be a record vote by mail election. And as of today, there's like 48 million votes have already been cast by mail, 73 million early votes, but most of those are cast by mail. And the litigation that's going to continue going on during the election and past the election about how these are going to be counted can be pretty critical. And two states where they can't even start opening these ballots and looking at them and processing them until election day are Pennsylvania and Wisconsin. So, I mean, unless there's some sort of blowout in the in-person voting in the first count that night, we might not know what's going on in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. There's other states that are more like Washington where they can, Florida, Arizona can pre-process the ballots, get them out of their envelopes, have them all queued up and start counting them. But they can't even do that in those states. So how how that plays out next Tuesday and how it's going to be covered is going to be pretty interesting. So I'll stop there. I think that was 5 minutes.
Thank you. So we have our first prediction, not about the outcome of the election, but if it's not a blowout, that there may be unprecedented litigation about the election following it. Carolyn.
Great. Thank you very much for inviting me to be a part of this panel. As someone who's covered a lot of election nights, I can tell you they're like the Super Bowl and the World Series of journalism combined. I mean, this is the stuff political journalists live for. And sometimes to our detriment because we don't always do the best job. So this year is exceptional in many ways. We are in the middle of a crisis of confidence in the fourth estate, right? Trust in journalism is very low. Trust in political journalism is even lower. At the same time, we have this proliferation of misinformation. Technology has given us these tools to, Twitter, to spread things globally, instantly, virally, right? We haven't had those. We've had those for one previous election, really. And also, I would say journalists are having a bit of a hangover from 2016, right? And now we're in a global pandemic, which wasn't the case in 2016. So we add all of these influences together and we can see that we're in for a wild ride. And we have been in for a wild ride for about the past year in terms of really trying to get a hold of how this election is going to shake out. A couple of I think the key mistakes that journalists are trying to reflect upon, at least I hope they're trying to reflect upon, from 2016 are, they really miscast Hillary Clinton as the predictive winner. They much more strongly represented her than the polls would have indicated. And you'll see that sometimes now, where there's a lot of coverage of comparing, say, Biden's lead in a swing state versus Hillary's lead in a swing state, right? And you're like, well, where was that news in 2016? I don't think you were reporting it quite that way then. Also, at that time, and I think this is still a problem, there was a failure on the part of journalists to really know the audience, right? There's a reason that the term flyover states came to be during and after the 2016 election, and that played out for journalists too. Journalists are human beings and tend to interview people, source people, quote people, use people as experts who look and think more like they do, right? So two things happened. People who people who were living in rural areas were largely overlooked, and also race as an issue was largely overlooked and or chunked into these homogenous groups that have never made sense but get to be used anyway. So there was a lack of attention to those things, and I think that's still going on, but I do see a little bit of a change there for the better. Another thing that was going on that I think has not changed at all is that journalists are largely still like functioning within their own Twitter bubbles. They're really writing for other journalists more than they're writing for the audience, and they are still paying more attention to what politicians are saying rather than to the systems that need to be interrogated behind that, although we are seeing a little bit of a turn there. We are seeing in 2020, we have seen an increased attention to issues of voter suppression and voter access, how systems work, rather than just who's leading in the polls, this kind of horse race journalism that it has never been a good thing and everyone says it's bad, but then they do it anyway. We're seeing a little bit more interrogation of the systems. And this is something I always teach my students in my journalism classes. You have to interrogate the systems. How should they work and how are they working? And we're seeing a little bit more care and attention paid to that. We're also seeing a little bit more in coverage of journalists attempting to meet the audience's informational needs. I'm thinking about articles on like, how to cure your ballot if it's been rejected. Things we've never really seen covered well in news before. And we're seeing more of that now. So a little sameness and a little improvement. And how that's going to play out after November 3rd kind of remains to be seen. I'll look forward to talking about that a little bit more.
And thank you for a carefully balanced assessment of some of the challenges in reporting, as well as some of the improvements that we're seeing recently. We'll start with a question that we received earlier, and Rudy will tackle it first, and other panelists may or may not jump in. What states are least prepared to help voters exercise their rights? What can be done to improve their service to constituents, if anything?
Yeah, and that's a really great question. I want to put the answer just out there. I think that the states that are the least prepared to serve their constituents, to help them express that fundamental right to vote, are states that are largely unprepared by choice. Right? There's not a lot of accidents that go on with this, and I'd be interested to hear Todd's this on well. But in my opening comments, I mentioned Texas and how Texas has closed scores of ballot drop boxes. That wasn't an accident. That wasn't an act of unpreparedness. They had these ballot drop boxes before, but now they're closing them. You can look at Missouri, for example. In Missouri, unlike in California, where I came from, in California, if you wanted to get an absentee ballot, you could just go send in an application and you would have one. That's how I voted by mail when I was in California. But in Missouri and in many other states, you can't vote by mail unless you provide a valid excuse, such as being over the age of 65, having a serious health condition, or whatever the case may be. And if this wasn't bad enough in Missouri, your ballot will not be accepted unless you go and get that mail-in ballot notarized. And of course, to have something notarized, you have to pay a fee. And it's not a large fee, but it's still a fee, which in my opinion, basically amounts to a modern day poll tax on our citizens who are already the most disadvantaged, because again, you can only get a mail-in ballot if you show a severe need for it. What can be done to improve this? Unfortunately, not a lot, right? States that are unprepared or states that are doing this by choice. As Todd mentioned, these cases are often going to end up going to the courts if folks try to get these laws overturned. But the problem is that in most states, court officials are elected and they have biases just like anyone else has. And even if you end up taking these laws to the courts, there's no guarantee that they're going to end up being overturned. Voter suppression is something that's very hard to prove. It's a very strict standard. And if requiring folks to show an excuse to vote by mail, if requiring folks to go out and pay money to get that notarized, if that's not voter suppression, then honestly, I don't know what is.
Yeah, Todd.
I'll jump in there. Because when I heard that question, the interesting thing to me is about protecting rights. I assume right to vote. And one of the oddities or problems of our election system is there really isn't a constitutional standard of a right to vote for the courts to protect. It's all decentralized to the states. So whether you're talking about redistricting or registration or voter ID laws or how you get an absentee ballot or the length of number of hours in the day that polling places are open, that can vary, and it does vary tremendously across the states. And historically, southern states have been some of the worst in terms of having shorter polling place hours, 30-day restrictions in advance of elections to register, even to this day. But yeah, and I'll throw it back to the partisan side of this, and states with Republican-controlled legislatures and governors doing everything they can to make things more difficult to vote. So I guess flipping the question around, the states where and I won't call it a right, but your ability to vote is maybe most protected, or states, as Rudy said, that are willing to be prepared for this sort of stuff, like Oregon and Washington, Colorado, Utah.
Wonderful. We're going to move to the next question, another one we received earlier. This one will start with Carolyn, and then I thought perhaps Rudy or Todd would like to comment on maybe what a political scientist would like to see. So the question is, how is the news election coverage adapting to during a pandemic? How is this coverage changing? And Carolyn, take us away.
Yeah, so I'll go back also to this idea of a lack of confidence in journalism as an institution, a reduced confidence in government institutions. There is just this lack of trust. And so one way to adapt to that is, from a journalism standpoint, is to rebuild trust, right? That's how we improve journalism's function as a democratic institution. And that speaks to two things, I think, and maybe this is oversimplified, but this is how I see it. The first thing we need to do as journalists is to meet our audience's informational needs, right? Journalists need to stop writing for other journalists, right? Getting a scoop is like a very journalism-y thing. The audience would much rather care that you get it right rather than that you get it first. That's in fact enshrined in our Society of Professional Journalists Code of Ethics. And so where it says speed is no excuse for inaccuracy. So we need to get past this kind of competitive thing about competing with other journalists and really think about foregrounding the audience's informational needs. And to do that, we have to actually talk to the audience and not just to elected officials and not just to folks in power, but to understand that. In doing that, we also earn their trust because they see themselves reflected in our coverage, not inappropriately, not monolithically like we have done in the past, but really they see their actual day-to-day concerns reflected. We're seeing a little bit of this when you look at, say, a lot of the TV journalists who will do live shots standing in line, right, in these very, very long lines with, people who are like holding babies and they're standing in the rain and they're really talking about their real lives. So in one way, I think we are doing a little bit better job of meeting the audience's informational needs, or at least understanding that that's what we are supposed to be doing. Another thing that we can do to build trust is just this constant fact checking. And we're really seeing this ramp up. Fact checking is actually recognized as a type of journalism, not just something done after the fact, right? We're used to say after a debate, it gets fact checked and we count how many inaccurate claims were made by either candidate, right? But fact checking has been a daily part of coverage. In fact, just in September, the New York Times unveiled a brand new feature called Daily Distortions, which it seeks to look not only at inaccuracies, but also to contextualize misleading claims. And really journalism having to prove that it's credible, this is not a bad thing. I think this is just good journalism, right? We're not transcribers, we're reporters. We're verifying the accuracy of information. We're not just spitting it out again. And so I think that during this pandemic, people are eager for something they can trust. And meeting the people where they are, figuring out what their informational needs are, and then just this steady, regular practice of fact checking, which journalists have always done behind the scenes, but now we're kind of pulling back the curtain and saying, hey, look, here's what we're doing, and this is wrong. Making that really more transparent. That's something new, and I think something that will probably continue, and I think it's good. I think it's good for everybody. I think it's a good practice. It shows those strong foundations of journalism and how important they are.
I think that leads in one. Oh, Todd, were you going to add what
No,
would
that's really interesting. I don't, maybe Rudy could have hear his impression. Political science, we think of like the media way much more than journalism. So it's encouraging to hear a journalist talk about, the improvements they're trying to make. But all I can think about is, particularly with trust and COVID, is the media as these kind of siloed sources of information that people self-select where they get the message they want to hear. There's people who don't trust the New York Times, so it doesn't matter how much fact checking they're going to do. And there's people who only trust Fox, and if they say COVID isn't real, they're getting the information they're going to get. But it's just, I find it interesting, like, because I'm never really thinking about individual journalists in terms of how people get information, but where they select to get their information, and how that's playing out now with COVID is you can find information that reinforces your belief that it's not a problem or that it is a problem.
Yeah, you're 100% right about that polarization within news media sources too. I mean, there's numerous studies that have shown how homogenous the audience's news diet has become, right? It is, I only watch this, I only read this. Very, very few people are consuming their news from multiple sources. I'm a person who consumes news from multiple sources, and sometimes it almost makes my head explode. Not even that things are covered differently, but one thing is, covered for the whole front page over here, and it's never over here, or it's the top of the newscast over here, and it's never mentioned over here. And so it's not just that things have different narratives, it's that many things are just ignored entirely. And that's not factually inaccurate, right? It's not factually inaccurate to ignore a story. And so I think that's yet another layer that complicates the problem.
Yeah, and to kind of build off something that Carolyn said about journalists, writing for journalists, I think that a lot of what goes on in political science, especially as regards race and ethnicity, is political scientists writing for other political scientists. Political scientists didn't want to acknowledge that 30% of Latinos voted for Trump in 2016, despite all of our large-scale data sets doing that, right? Because how could that ever happen? I wrote a paper on that to kind of toot my own horn, and I looked at the reasons for why that might be. And going into 2020, we're still seeing a lot of the same folks in the discipline saying that, oh, that could never happen, that's not going to happen again. And the way that the polls are looking right now, it's highly likely that more Latinos are going to vote for Trump in 2020 than did in 2016, in spite of everything that's happened. So I think that's a trap that political scientists also fall into. And partly because I think Our research, I think, is definitely not as widespread as something that a journalist might put out. So I think that in a lot of cases, we don't have that accountability to the public, because who's really going out and searching for my article on Google Scholar? I don't think, well, aside from Carolyn, right, it's other academics, right? We don't have my dad going out and reading my article. That's not something that I think is very common.
That's so interesting that you bring that up, Rudy, because I look at this data too in my work. And what often frustrates me, and I'm curious, I'm not a political scientist, so I don't create the data sets, but again, this homogenization of Latinos as a political bloc, it doesn't square with reality of Cubans in Miami, right? I mean, is that a product of who's doing the research? And because, of course, the research that political scientists do gets reported on by journalists, right, who then normalize this construction of Panlatinidad that's really problematic. Should we be doing a better job or a different job with that kind of data collection?
And I think that's to credit journalists. I think when I was doing my research for my paper on why Latinos, this monolithic, supposed group, voted for Trump, I was actually going to journalists and looking at their work, because they were the ones who were actually out there interviewing Cuban folks and looking at the difference between Cubans and Mexican Americans. And I think that when you look at the Latino population, when you look at Asian Americans especially, right, Asian Americans, we tend to think of Asian Americans as one group, but the countries of origin, the languages spoken, the identities are so diverse that I think that part of that is that, to be frank, political scientists, we like to categorize things. We like to put people into boxes, because that makes it easier for us to do our work and to model our experiments and our models. But I think that often, we're doing that to our detriment.
And to be fair to journalism, there was an article recently, I think it was in the New York Times, about evangelical Mexican Americans in the United States who are overwhelmingly more supportive for Trump than 4 years ago. But maybe that's been in the social science literature. I haven't seen that yet.
This is fascinating. Another question we have, I think, opens another window onto this question of trust, and the dynamic exchange that you're having may shed some light on it. One shadow left over to the 2016 elections is polls, how much to trust polls and polling. And I'm interested in hearing, in answer to this question, of what have we learned in political science about polls since 2016, specifically how they're maybe conducted, how useful they are, how people are doing them, and then how they're being covered, how polls are being covered in the media, because I still hear a lot about polls, and this question, brings up that issue. Who would like to jump in? Todd, I saw.
And this is a half a joke. I think one of the things we learned from 2016 is don't let journalists cover polls. That's maybe not fair. And no, because I have a class where we're going over this right now. You had the New York Times, the Washington Post, Huffington Post giving Clinton 91 to 99% odds of winning, which is completely ridiculous and not something anything the polls were showing. It was the poll aggregators, the data journalists, as they're called, not really giving any sense of uncertainty to the data that they were getting, and then also ignoring that at the end of the day, the polls were more accurate in 2016 than they were in 2012. It's just that they were inaccurate by enough in 2012 that you didn't notice it, because they predicted a small Obama win and then we got a bigger Obama win. This time they couldn't predict the Electoral College. But there's supposedly there's a lot of adjustment going on in terms of what was maybe missed in 2016, including people without college degrees supposedly being undersampled. So we're trying to oversample that stuff more. But all that said is, there was thin polling in the last week in some key states. There was an unprecedented number of people whose minds weren't made up, and that just didn't really get into the narrative. It was Clinton's 99% certain to win, and you're still seeing that, but I think people are dialing that back a little bit this time around.
I think you're right. Journalists are being more cautious, and I agree with you that really most journalists should not touch polls. We are not known for our stellar mathematical abilities. But what I keep noticing is coverage that says things like, well, we don't want to put too much into the polls, but here's where what the polls say. And so it's almost this acknowledgement that this might not be accurate, but here's what it says anyway. And that to me that's pretty shoddy journalism. Either you use the solid data or you don't. Journalism has this long history of, this horse race coverage, and that seems to be the predominant frame in most news coverage. And if you look at studies of political candidacies, the horse race frame supersedes the candidate's qualifications, right? And we would hope that the candidate's qualifications would be the thing that's foregrounded when we're talking about a political race. Candidates' qualifications and issues, positions really fall down the list compared to like who's aligned with who or who's winning in the polls. And that's a real problem with journalism, and it's a problem that we've been studying since 1972 and talking about since 1972, and it still doesn't seem to change. There is this real pattern in journalism of the focus on who's ahead and not why or with whom. And so that's a place where journalism could really do so much better in terms of understanding the audience or voters' issues, positions, rather than just asking them how they're going to vote.
And to be fair to journalists, some of those predictions were done by social scientists that the journalists hired to come up with that stuff.
Mm-hmm. And to be fair to journalists, you have me thinking, Carolyn, about how much it might be the cultural expectations from the audience that are driving it. That is, how many of us want to look at elections as if we're betting on a horse race, right? So we're putting down our bets, and we want a vicarious experience in the race. And so a lot of the kind of a destabilization of information, it seems, actually kind of produces this kind of excitement, which people take in, perhaps in a bit of addictive, I mean addictive as a kind of a larger metaphor, but in consuming as a kind of addiction, as opposed to in a methodical way.
Absolutely. And this is what has me actually pretty nervous for how journalism is going to perform on November 3rd and November 4th. Twitter earlier this month actually created a new policy that said any candidate who says they won, we're going to flag your post unless the election results have also been verified by either election officials or 2 reputable national news organizations. And I thought, well, there's a can of worms. I mean, who decides who's reputable, right? And if you watch, the New York Times often on election night puts up a graphic of all the major news organizations and who has called the race for whom at what time. So you can actually watch it happen in real time. And usually it's within a few minutes of one another. And unfortunately, there is a little bit of this herd mentality where they're like, well, the Associated Press called it and NBC called it and the New York Times called it, so maybe we'll call it too. And I'm concerned about journalists being able to show restraint, because we're so wired to just want to tell the story, and to really make sure that things are solid and verified before they're being posted. Twitter has given journalists a big role here. We're the new gatekeepers of information, right? And who gets to tweet about it. I'm not gonna lie, I'm a little worried for my people. I hope they do the right thing.
We have a live question that's been asked that I'd like to work in. Probably start with Rudy or Todd. Maybe Rudy can take a first crack at it. What do the extremely high early voting numbers in Texas so far suggest about the overall turnout level expected in that state? And maybe could ask it more generally, because there's higher voter turnout numbers being reported, I think, in more than just Texas. But what kind of signal is that for us?
Yeah, I think as a political scientist, as someone who wants to see high turnout just as a democratic good, small d democratic good. I think that it's positive. It's good that we're having people turn out. I think it also speaks to the kind of atmosphere that's in the air about your vote not being counted or shenanigans occurring at the vote counting. I think people want to get out and vote early to be sure that their vote is being counted. When you look at Texas or other states, I think early when we saw a lot of votes coming in, we saw votes coming in predominantly Democratic areas. We saw Democratic voters, for the most part, being folks who were mailing in their ballots early, or if you went and look at the lines, the makeup of folks who were waiting in line to vote. But I think that recently we've seen a surge of Republicans as well, especially in Florida. So I think it's certainly balancing out. I don't want to make any predictions this early, but I think that early voter turnout is just not something that's limited to Democratic voters only. I think that now we're starting to see Republicans as well, because we can talk about the motivation on the side of Democratic voters to go out and vote and to make a change in the presidency, but we can't discount the enthusiasm that exists among Republicans as well.
We can remember the Republicans have mastered voting by mail in Florida, and it took President Trump a while to realize that. And state officials there were telling him to stop telling people not to vote by mail. But what are the turnout thing? I mean, the big question is does it advantage Democrats or Republicans if at the end of the day we have higher turnout? And I think the assumption is that it would advantage Democrats. And this, you can go back 2 years. The midterm we had in 2018 had dramatically more turnout than any midterm in a generation. So there's already something going on, and that benefited Democrats. So if that kind of mobilization, maybe it's an anti-Trump mobilization, continues, you think there'd be a net advantage for Democrats. The downside of it is maybe as good as voting by mail is, you're going to have more ballots rejected for various reasons without any nefarious stuff going on. So we'll have probably record numbers of rejected ballots, even though might be talking 1% or so than we would if we were having polling place voting.
I just wanted to comment also on something that Rudy said from a political science perspective. From a journalism perspective, the American Press Institute released a report earlier this month called Covering the Gears of Democracy. And they wrote a lot about how journalists are focusing on helping people vote, right? There's much more news much more news coverage of access to voting and understanding of voting systems. And we're seeing this unfold amidst this, changing in election methods. And I'm curious to see whether that will continue to go forward. I kind of think it will, if I had to guess. There's much more focus on helping people understand how the systems work. And I think that's also going to aid in turnout.
Wonderful. Going back, Carolyn, when you mentioned November 3rd, I think we have quite a couple of questions about November 3rd and 4th. How are we to experience those 2 days? And so maybe we could start with Todd and or Rudy commenting on how will they be looking at November 3rd and 4th from a political science perspective, from that lens. What are they going to be looking for in those 2 days? And then Carolyn, for you to comment on how you think that journalism is going to cover it, and what you'd like to see in the coverage in those 2 days.
Should I start?
Sure.
I think what I will be looking at is two main things. Three. How will the president respond? Because he's already said he's not going to acknowledge anything that is counted after the election, which would be, most of the ballots in Washington state. Second, how Republican elites will respond if he appears to be behind or potentially ahead, but will end up losing in states when mail ballots come in. And it's clear that that potentially can happen. Again, if there's not a huge lead, how will his fellow Republicans embrace his narrative if he continues the narrative that he's had? And then wrapped up all in that is how's the media going to be reporting it? And my sense is you expect very different messages coming from different media sources, the Fox, and I had the data on this for a class the other day. The percentage of conservatives whose only trusted news source is Fox is much more dramatic than the percentage of liberals and progressives that, they sort of split around a bunch of other liberal progressive sites that they maybe trust. So how that messaging are the elites and the conservative media going to reinforce the president's messaging if it's close? And those are huge unknowns, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. To Todd's point, I think that that uncertainty. I've already told family members that we're probably not likely going to have a clear result on November 3rd unless there's some kind of large blowout. And when you look at the states that are really going to decide everything, when you look at Michigan, when you look at Pennsylvania, I think Pennsylvania is going to be one to look out for. As Todd mentioned, if they're not going to, some counties in Pennsylvania have already said that they're going to count the mail-in votes last. And I think that it's probably going to come down to those mail-in votes being decided. So November 3rd, we might not, I'll certainly be watching, but I don't know that we'll have any definite results. This is probably going to end up extending until November 4th and 5th. To get some concrete results and to have those ballots counted.
Yeah, I mean, we've been here before. In 2000, we had to wait, a whole month, I think. Is that right? I think it's right. Before we had, definitive results. And that was before we had Twitter. So we're in a whole new world now. I think, what Todd is saying is right. I suspect that there are news outlets that will, and I'm not even going to say it's partisan, but there are news outlets that will follow one camp and news outlets that will follow another camp, right? And then there are other news outlets who will hopefully do a better job of examining voting versus results, right? Of examining, was there voter suppression? Was there any tampering? Really taking a hard look at our systems and how they're designed to work with these things. I really, I don't think anybody's interested to look at the front page every day and for it to say, yep, we still don't know, right? There has to be some substantive work into why don't we know? In the state of Washington, I think, we've got this pretty dialed in with mail-in voting, and I think this will be pretty much the same old for our state election, and that's a nice position for us to be in. But in terms of national results, I mean, we're not going to know for a long time, and journalists need to really turn their attention to why we don't know. And things like what Rudy said about places where mail-in ballots are being counted last, or what Todd said about, whether or not voters' ballots will be counted if they are not received by election day, even if they were postmarked by election day. We need to look at all of those systems. It might not sound like sexy or exciting or, top of the full big headlines, but we really need to, journalists really need to do a good job of interrogating those voting systems, because that really is the cornerstone of where this democratic process unfolds.
We have Todd.
I was going to say that we did go through this in 2000, but it was one state, and it was George Bush and Al Gore. We didn't have Donald Trump in 2000, so that's a bit different.
Yeah, thank you for that clarification. We have a question, a live question that's just appeared that I think is an important one, because you've spoken to it, but the relationship is a very complex one. So I think we could use to hear more about it. And using Texas as an example, if there's been voter suppression efforts in Texas, but there's also extremely high early voting going on, how can those two be happening at the same time? Is it that voter suppression do we have evidence that it actually hasn't been effective, or as Rudy already suggested may have actually provoked a higher turnout, or people reacting to it have turned out in higher numbers? Or what is that relationship between voter turnout and voter suppression?
Yeah, I think You know, one thing that students always find interesting when I bring it up is that a lot of the research in political science actually suggests that voter ID laws, perhaps, you know, one of the more common forms of voter suppression recently, a lot of the research in political science that is looked at, you know, before and after elections suggests that voter ID laws don't actually have any effect on turnout that we can discern. And political scientists, I think, are cautious to say, well, it could be the case that when you threaten someone's right to vote, or the privilege to vote, depending on which camp you stand in, that you know, motivates folks to actually go out and head to the polls. And just due to the nature of the research that exists, it could entirely be the case that yes, voter ID laws are suppressing turnout, but then you're also seeing this push from people who are having their right to vote threatened that then causes them to turn out. And I think that if we are seeing a kind of counter mobilization effect, I think part of it is due to what Carolyn mentioned with journalists. Now in 2020, certainly, and I noticed this in 2016 as well. Like prior to 2016, I didn't see news stories saying like, hey, this is how you register to vote, or you have to mail in your ballot by this date. It has to be postmarked by this date. I think that journalists and the media more broadly are doing a great job at informing people with the little, you know, parts and mechanisms that go into making sure that your ballot is actually counted.
And another way we can maybe have voter suppression efforts and have high turnout too is you look at Texas and you look at some of these places, early voting in North Carolina, people are willing to go out and stand in line for 3 or 4 hours, which is just, I can't imagine that because I just have to walk to the box and drop my ballot off. But yeah, I think Rudy's correct. You know, when early voting was restricted in previous election cycles, you know, that the people who are doing the souls to the polls early voting stuff then found other mobilization efforts can say, and they tell people they're trying to keep you from voting. So you've got that motivation going on. But I'm just struck by when people are worried that their vote might not be counted and you make it harder for them to vote, they'll go out there and stand in line for an enormous amount of time.
We have another question, which I think gives another a useful window into that issue of trust. And we had several questions about trust, and this one connects with that. And that's got to do with the electoral college versus the popular vote. And that includes reporting about the electoral college, which can be hard to do because it's pretty complex. But there's because the last election was, and it's not the first one, where the popular vote was different than the results of the electoral college. How do you see that as being part of this trust situation? Is that having any factor in what's going on with this election? Todd.
Depends if you're a Democrat or Republican. And I'm not kidding. No, public opinion research, even before 2016, there's very different attitudes. Republicans think the Electoral College is the legitimate result and that it exists for a reason to protect states' interests. And they win by it, whereas Democrats don't see it as legitimate. So if you have another split like we had in 2000 or 2016, it really depends who we're talking about in terms of whether that makes them more or less trusting.
I think some news organizations have done a good job of trying to provide some context and understanding. I know since at least 2008, the New York Times has produced different kinds of interactive graphics. The last one looked kind of like a jellyfish of paths to victory, and this one is more you like drag bubbles. If Trump wins this one, then he gets this many votes, and if Biden wins this one, he gets this many votes. And I think it's a pretty simple little graphic, but it does kind of drive home this is how things work. But then you have to also balance that with people who are every day saying 52, 48, you know, and talking about, you know, overall popular vote statistics. So we're talking about it in two different ways in journalism, and I don't know that that's the most helpful thing.
And we have time for, oh, I'm sorry, Rudy, did you want to come in?
Yeah, just to echo Todd's point, it's a question of the rules of the game, right? Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on where you stand, the electoral college, those are the rules of the game. Those are the rules that you have to play by if you want to win. And I think that as time goes forward, as we see population shifts occur, and as we start to see the coasts kind of become more and more populous, I think it's going to increasingly be the case that we're likely going to have to re-examine the Electoral College as an institution, because I was a child during the 2000 election. I remember that election, and asking my mom and dad, like, why don't we know who the president is yet? What's going on? Or how could someone become president if they lost the popular vote? I saw that again in 2016, and I'm bracing to possibly see that again in 2020. So this isn't perhaps going to go away anytime soon. But yeah, it's a question of the rules of the game. And as Todd said, the rules of the game currently benefit Republicans. So we see why they have such a strong support for the Electoral College compared to Democrats.
This is perhaps a good place to fit in another question we received before the webinar started, in terms of looking at other models. This is a specific question. What lessons can the US learn from how New Zealand conducts its elections? We could say maybe larger. Are there, in the United States, we're very proud of our models, but are there any others from a political science perspective we should be looking at, or they'd be a little easier to report on? We just have a few minutes left, so maybe start with Todd.
Yeah, I mean, New Zealand doesn't elect the president, so they have a parliamentary system. Everybody just votes in districts, and it's proportional representation. And the party leaders have deep roots in the party, so and it's fundamentally different in all sorts of ways. And some people would see, that may be a more fair system given the proportionality. But it's a country, like a lot of places, where there is a respected national agency that administers elections. And I think for that reason, it generates higher levels of turnout and trust.
Mm. Yeah, so having some kind of, you made the comment before that it's so highly decentralized in the United States. Each state has really fairly dramatically different rules and procedures in voting. And so some more nationalization to build a trust as a nation about our elections might be something to at least look at. Okay, I think this is a good place to start. I want to just personally, as a moderator, thank all three panelists who were amazing. I learned so much. The interaction was dynamic in that I really got to see different perspectives going on. And I heard some information that I hadn't come across before. So thank you so much. And now to Dean Paredes.
Thank you, Mark. I want to thank everybody in our virtual audience for being here with us today. Hopefully you feel inspired and better informed, and with lots of energy to go out and vote if you haven't done it yet. Certainly for me, this was very interesting, a great learning opportunity. I want to finish by really thanking our three panelists. Todd, Carolyn, and Rudy. I am so thankful that you volunteered your time and your expertise to be with us today. It's really appreciated, and it's a great way for your departments, for the college, and for you to share your knowledge and help our audience to better understand the upcoming elections. And with that, thank you finally to Mark, of course, to the alumni office, and to our administrative assistant, Susanna Glatz, who were behind the scenes, making sure everything was working okay, as well as our transcription specialists who were making sure that our event was accessible for everyone. And it's 1 p.m. It's our end time. Thank you so much, everybody. And we hope to see you in our next webinar.
Thanks very much.